Well, welcome back to the Sandton Convention Centre and, of course, day 2 of the BRICS Summit. And, of course, we're expecting all the leaders of the BRICS countries in attendance here to arrive shortly before 10 this morning. But, of course, much in terms of discussion to be had about all the key touch points that we will also get into with our researcher here at SABC News, Velim Tiane. That's coming up. But before that, let's catch up with Sophie Mokoena, who's, of course, here at the Sandton Convention Centre as well, making sure that SABC has wall-to-wall coverage of the events taking place. Sophie, good morning.
Well, of course, indeed, Sakina, we are here at the Sandton Convention Centre. We are looking at today, a very important day, because the leaders will have the first meeting, and therefore they will go behind closed doors to discuss what we expect to be important issues like the expansion of BRICS, the issue of the currency, but other global issues that we have been grappling with, the war in Ukraine, the impact of the COVID-19, how do you revive the economy of the globe, but particularly the economies in relation to the BRICS member countries. But with me, I have Leon Sinyange, who was at the Russia-Africa Summit, where these issues were also discussed. But before we talk about this summit, let's look at the Africa-Russia Summit. The talk around President Putin not attending this summit. What were the delegates saying, particularly because you had African leaders?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me. Yes, the discussion around President Vladimir Putin's absence from the BRICS Summit here, of course, seemed more of a matter for other states than it probably did for African leaders. So the important thing for us here is that African leaders looked more at the benefits that they were potentially able to get from Russia itself, more than whether President Vladimir Putin would be able to attend here or not. But for the summit in itself, I think the absence of President Vladimir Putin says much, or doesn't take much out of it. Russia has been represented by their foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. So therein, you feel that Russia is still present in this summit. Their discussions therein will still matter to the outcomes of this particular summit. And like you say, the outcomes on the expansion and the currency, the BRICS currency that many are looking forward to having. And definitely the discussions, I think, should be fruitful.
Let's look at what was said yesterday, particularly the leaders. The presentation or the speech by President Vladimir Putin, we knew that he was going to participate virtually. What did you make of that address? I mean, he was very, very clear in terms of what Russia wants from this summit and this group going forward.
Absolutely. Russia's come out to make its stance on what exactly they want from this particular summit. And therein is, one, the expansion is a very critical issue. They want to see a bigger bloc that the BRICS should be. They also want to see better trading with countries that are within the BRICS and group itself. If you realize quite well that Russia has taken a dip in the kind of exchanges they're having with the BRICS partners because of the sanctions they're in. But now they feel that if they're able to concretize this kind of this bloc, then they should be able to expand their economies and their kind of trading, but not just within the member states of the BRICS bloc itself. They're looking for partners elsewhere, and now we can see Russia's involvement in Africa specifically, not just in terms of their technical support, but then also digging deep into the economies, agriculture, technology, education.
And the military, you talk about the Wagner Group in Central Africa, and now with Niger, some people saying, yes, Africa, we are willing to welcome whoever wants to invest on the continent. But we have to be careful in terms of we don't see what we saw previously in relation to colonialism, particularly on issues of conflict.
Yeah, definitely. It's taken a very different tide this time round, where you have a military group trying to take control of African affairs and African leaders seemingly accepting that to happen. That tells much about our own potential as Africans, as African leaders, to try and control the political spaces that and governance that we should be able to, and for long have been singing about. But now when we have another group trying to take control of that, then it tells much about what our capacities could be.
Let's look at President Xi Jinping. He was not here. Yes, he arrived a day before, almost early hours. I mean, when you look at the time zone, the altitude, yes, and he had to wake up and go to union buildings, maybe one can say he needed some hours just to recover, because he was going to go to the retreat, a private meeting, which is crucial because that's where they were going to discuss all the thorny issues. But the picture didn't look good, because all of us, we were waiting for that first picture, the first picture of the 5.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it took the sting out of the moment that the BRICS Summit actually was looking forward to, having all the leaders there, and the Prime Minister Narendra Modi from India, Inácio Lula da Silva from Brazil, President Cyril Ramaphosa himself, who actually welcomed Xi Jinping on Tuesday, and that meeting they had in Pretoria. But I think that is only just for the beginning. The critical issues will be discussed today, and that is where his presence probably matters the most. The critical issues, again, will be discussed also tomorrow. President Xi Jinping's presence there matters just as much. And there's a meeting with African leaders, so I think the absence here may only say a little, but the bigger discussions where his presence really matters most is where we would need to look.
You are from East Africa.
Yes.
I looked at East African leaders who have been invited. I didn't see President Kagame, I didn't see President Ruto, I didn't see President Museveni, yes, Uganda, where you come from. Yes. Fortunately, you have President Sulu Hassan, and the only woman in the room, I guess, at that time when the meeting starts with African leaders. What is East Africa saying about this bloc?
Well, I don't quite see much coming out of East Africa community itself. For Tanzania's story, it's a bit different. I mean, they belong partly to the southern part of Africa in terms of trade. They trade a lot more down south, so the interest could be different. But then also,
is it not a question of allegiance to the West?
No, not really. I think it's a question of just how much is the East African community trying to consolidate itself, because there have been challenges within the East African community. DRC was recently introduced to the group. Not much has been discussed in terms of ending the conflict in DRC. That is a very big issue that the East African community has to deal with. So I would personally think that probably trying to discuss issues of being part of the BRICS bloc would be another meal on their plate, yet they're yet to accomplish a few other things on their own side. So, but I think it's a process. It's a process of discussion, and the interest therein is that the other East African countries should be able to see the opportunities that the BRICS bloc is willing to offer. President Cyril Ramaphosa is opening this bloc more to African nations than probably any other part of the world. So the interest therein should be, and I want to believe that the African leaders, maybe specifically from where I come from, East Africa, should be able to tap into this.
How do you locate the African Continental Free Trade Area in terms of ensuring that Africa has taken a position to integrate in terms of trade and investment, so that when they go out there, they can leverage on the bigger GDP, but also population, 1.2 billion, and it's much better country to country. It's very small. Do you think this group will be able to fuse in the African Continental Free Trade Area? I'll tell you why. When the previous leaders, Obasanjo, Mbeki, who started NEPAD, introduced NEPAD to the G8 then, which is G7 now, there was a buying, and particularly Germany was very vocal to incorporate the NEPAD as a developmental blueprint of the continent so that you can work with the entire continent. Do you think BRICS will be able to accommodate the decision that we have taken as a continent to lobby as a bloc?
Well, I still think it's a bit of a long shot, and that potentially is my own opinion, but probably the opinion of several others. Why? And I'll go back to where I come from. Uganda and Kenya are still fighting over milk, eggs, and chicken, and potentially maize. So if we can't trade on those kind of commodities, how shall we then be able to trade more expansively? Yes, how shall we be able to, as a bloc of East Africa itself, community, to try and create this one commodity that we can sell out and grow our economies? So with that small cluster and the barriers that are within the small cluster, what then else happens elsewhere? So that tells much about how much work needs to be done for Africa to come together and try and consolidate the opportunities that could come with, well, being a bloc and, pushing for things as a bloc.
So we still have to strengthen the regional organizations, your SADC, your ECOWAS, your East Africa community, your IGAD. And it comes at a time where you have these pockets of conflict on the continent. You have the DRC, as you pointed out. We have another problem in the SADC region, our neighbor Mozambique, Cabo Delgado. Now you have this big one, Niger. So how do you consolidate the regional organizations?
That in itself is already a downfall to the potential that we have to try and consolidate this. We have, as Africa, as a continent, we've had conflicts for a very long time and continue to still have conflicts. Every other year, something is happening in West Africa. Uganda is planning on sending a few troops, to Mozambique, just like South Africa, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So until we Sudan itself. So until we are able to reduce or even still eliminate the conflict, then we should be able to have the opportunity to discuss better and think better and grow better. Until that happens, I still think it's a long shot to have all these organizations consolidating and moving Africa forward.
Thank you, Leon. Leon, you are around. We'll continue to engage in these discussions. This is Leon Sinyange, our correspondent in Uganda, looking to East Africa stories and giving us those stories. But for now, let's go and pay the bills.